going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the law school. I'm Sophia Lee. I'm a longtime faculty member here and the Dean of Penn Cary Law. And we are very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, or CERL if you aren't familiar with it already. Today's program explores current risks to democratic governance in the U.S. and abroad. And this is a hallmark of CERL's programming more generally. Today's topic couldn't be more timely. This event is occasioned by the opportunity we have had this semester to host Wojciech Sadurski, a leading Polish constitutional law scholar and a consummate public intellectual. So we're all very lucky to have Wojciech with us and to benefit from his insights today. It's been a true pleasure welcoming him to Penn Cary Law this semester through our Bach Visiting International Professor program. My colleague Claire Finkelstein will introduce Professor Sadurski more fully in a few moments. And we are also joined by a wonderful group of panelists from Penn Cary Law and across the university. They are sitting with their backs to you right now, but very soon they will be sitting with their faces facing you at the front of the room. So thank you all for being here as well. And for those of you who may not be familiar with CERL, I expect there's not that many of you in the room, but there may be some. It is an interdisciplinary center dedicated to examining rule of law questions as they arise in national security law and democratic governance. It's often at the forefront of difficult issues involving armed conflict, military law, executive authority, and democratic norms. And CERL has really earned a national reputation for its work defending and promoting the rule of law. Just recently, they filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court on behalf of more than 150 members of Congress. And this was in the case Trump versus Illinois, which concerned the president's authority to deploy the National Guard in Chicago. Before we begin today's program, I am going to just take a moment to remember a beloved part of the Penn Cary Law community, Robert Fuller Jr. He was a dear friend of CERL and of Penn Cary Law, whose tragic passing on February 14th has been deeply felt in our community. A member of the law school class of 1964, Mr. Fuller was a distinguished lawyer and a committed public servant. After practicing law in Maine, he served as an enlisted Marine and later as a reserve officer in the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the U.S. Navy. He commanded 2 reserve units and retired with the rank of captain, a name he never shed. He was referred to by many throughout his life as he also served as an assistant attorney general in Maine before founding his own law firm. Mr. Fuller was deeply committed to public service and to philanthropy. Among many acts of generosity, he helped build a shelter for women veterans in Maine. And at Penn Cary Law, he endowed a professorship that bears his name and is currently held by Professor Gideon Parchamovsky. He also gave generously to CERL and to the law school more broadly. We very grateful. All right, I am now going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Claire Finkelstein. Professor Finkelstein is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy and serves as faculty director at CERL. Her research focuses on national security law and policy, democratic governance, presidential authority, and the law of armed conflict. She is co-editor of the Oxford series on ethics, national security, and the rule of law, and has edited 6 volumes in that series. She's also a widely sought-after commentator on issues of national security and democratic governance. You very well may have encountered her in whatever your news source is. Please join me in welcoming Professor Finkelstein.
Thank you so much, Dean Lee, and I'm so grateful to Penn Cary Law for so many things, for hosting this event with us, for hosting Professor Sadurski, who it's been wonderful, a delight to have here, and for the warm remembrance about Bob. I'd like to just start by continuing for a moment on that theme. And I hope that I can get through this without breaking up. Captain Bob, as we knew him, was a dear friend, someone who worked with me to help build up the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. He cared passionately about the rule of law and about military law and about professional ethics. One of the things that made him most furious is when he saw military lawyers not supporting the rule of law, not caring about it, and not obeying the ethos of the profession. He was extremely nonpartisan in that orientation and really sought to support what was right. And it was that spirit that animated his support of Searle and our work together. Bob used to send me all sorts of charming, witty, funny, and also very serious emails. 2 weeks before he died, we had a long conversation about the boat strikes. He was very upset about the JAGs that may have authorized those strikes. He was very angry about it, and he was doing a lot of research on that question. And he wanted to know, how could military lawyers have authorized these strikes that to him were patently illegal? He was also very concerned about the deployment of the National Guard in U.S. cities. And he was very supportive of the work that we've been doing in that area to bring amicus briefs. And a little while ago, as many of you who knew him might have known, he was a charming and very gifted writer. He wrote a novel many, many years ago, and periodically when we were working on something, he would just dash off a piece of writing of one sort or another, sometimes partly fiction, sometimes partly serious. And so in the fall, he sent me a piece on the occasion of our work on the deployment of the National Guard about the Posse Comitatus Act, which is, for those of you who are not familiar, the act that says that it is not permissible for federal troops to engage in law enforcement activities. And I just wanted to read you, because it's so Bob and so charming, a little snippet of what he wrote. He wrote, "Let's imagine John Wayne, appointed by the governor of Texas as the sheriff of Crockett County, hot on the trail of Jesse James and his gang who have just robbed the Crockett County Cattlemen's Bank. He rounds some cowboys to chase down the outlaws. Sheriff Wayne's just formed a classic example of a posse comitatus. However, Sheriff Wayne can't ask Colonel Gary Cooper, the commanding officer of 1st Squadron, U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment at Fort Kickapoo, for help because ordinarily the act prohibits using soldiers from enforcing other than laws governing military operations and their administration." And then he launched into a very apt and well-analyzed discussion of the legality of the act. But that's how he started his essay. So Bob, we'll remember you always, and we'll miss you terribly. So now I need to recover and introduce our panelists. So if the panelists will come join me here at the table. If you can just check your name tags here. I think I'm Wojcik here, Rogers, Mitch, and Bill. It is with great pleasure now that I introduce our panelists for today's program. Professor Wojciech Serdursky will be first on my left, who is a Bach visiting international professor at Carey Law. A lawyer, political philosopher, and commentator on public affairs, Professor Serdursky is also the Challis Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney and professor at the University of Warsaw Center for Europe. His most recent book, Constitutional Public Reason, published in 2023, defends the philosophical principle of public reason and incorporates it into the field of constitutional theory through comparative analysis and examples. Then we have Roger Smith. Professor Smith, who also happens to be a member of Searle's affiliated faculty, is the Christopher Brown Distinguished Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Penn. His research centers on constitutional law, American political thought, and modern legal and political theory, with special interest in questions of citizenship, race, ethnicity, and gender. His 1997 book, Civic Ideals, Conflicting Citizenship in U.S. History, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. Next, we have Mitchell Ornstein. Professor Ornstein is a professor of Russian and East European Studies at Penn and senior fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute. His sole authored and co-authored works on the political economy and international affairs of Central and Eastern Europe have won numerous prizes. His most recent book, Taking Stock of Shock, with Oxford University Press in 2021, was co-authored with Professor Kristen Godsey and evaluates the social consequences of the 1989 revolutions that ended communism in Central and Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. And I should say that his book, The Lands in Between, with which Searle did a book talk a number of years ago, has been a very important work for me, in particular in guiding my work and knowledge of cyber activities in Eastern Europe. And finally, we have the law school's own Bill Burke-White. Professor Burke-White is a leading expert on U.S. foreign policy, multilateral institutions, and international law, and a professor at Penn Law. He researches and writes on the relationship between law and politics in international affairs, and his particular expertise on the design and implementation of complex global governance solutions that involve multiple countries, international institutions, and multilateral legal regimes. Professor Burke-White is a non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and serves as senior advisor to White and Case. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to switch seats now and take my place as moderator of the discussion. So what I'm going to do, we're not going to have any formal presentation from the panelists. We're just going to have a conversation. But what I want to do is to begin by asking each of them how they relate to the current subject matter. And so I want to start with you, Wojciech. You were targeted by the Polish government, the far-right Polish government, for your outspoken criticism of that government and your activities defending democracy. So I wonder if that is very germane to our subject matter today, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that and what the attacks were, how you responded to them, and what the outcome of the cases was.
Sure, thank you very much. But first I would like, well, first of all, to share in your sorrow about the departure of Mr. Fuller. And also I would like to use this occasion, as it is probably the last time I'm, this year at least, here at UPenn, because I'll be going back to Australia soon, how much I appreciate this opportunity of having been here, BOK international visitor. I really am extremely grateful to Dean Lee, to Professor Finkelstein, to all my colleagues and friends whom I've met here. I'm a bit of a veteran of various fellowships and visiting professorships, etc. And I must say that I can hardly think of a more gratifying, satisfying, and enjoyable stay, including my classes for your absolutely wonderful cohort of students as at UPenn. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been great being here. Now, going back to Claire's question, indeed, I was, a bit of an exemplar of a famous or maybe infamous maxim attributed to a certain Benvenides, who was a Peruvian dictator in the first half of the 20th century, who said, "For my friends, everything. for my enemies, the law. So I was on the second side of that equation. They threw the book at me by launching 3 different court cases in a short period of time in early 2018. All 3 basically can be seen as governmental defamation cases against me, although formally speaking, one was by a state-run TV, but it was governmental TV. 2 were by state TV, and 1 was by the ruling party, the government party, that is so-called Law and Justice Party. Okay. So I had 2 defamation cases from TV, 1 civil defamation, 1 criminal defamation. So they acted not only as a plaintiff against me, as a defendant, in the case for protection of their right to good name and reputation, which really sounded very funny in the context of what they've been doing, this sort of like shameless propaganda they've been doing, and 1 civil case by the Law and Justice Party, signed by the leader of the party, Jarosław Kaczyński, who ironically enough years ago was my friend as a student of law at the University of Warsaw, but it really doesn't matter. So I ended up by going all the way up in 1 case to the Supreme Court for the so-called cassation, where my plaintiff, this public TV, went all the way to the Supreme Court. 2 cases ended earlier, 1 with the on appeal, and another, the case was withdrawn after the coming of the new government to power, who withdrew the civil case against me for public TV. Okay, I don't want to go into any detail. I just want to say this, that I've won all the way. I mean, all the judgments, and there were 7 judgments in my case, they ruled in my favor. Judges ruled in my favor. It was an interesting experience for the following reason. So I just want, and I'll try to be very, very brief, I drew sort of like 2 lessons from this experience. 1 more personal, another more structural. So the more personal lesson is that it is really worth taking on a ruthless government who wants to pretend that they act within the principles of legality, and to use this argument, use legal resources, legal arguments against them. It is actually quite exhilarating doing it in a state where the authoritarian government has more or less destroyed all the checks and balances and the primacy of the Constitution, not to mention the primacy of European law. But at the same in the country in which the degree of oppression and violation of rights is relatively moderate. So the risks for someone like me are relatively low. So I feel that I was net beneficiary of all that. I could, for once, practice what I preached most of my life, teaching about constitutionalism and human rights and liberty and so on. And I could use some of this courtroom experience to engage in my little j'accuse, to be a little bit pompous, and deliver some sort of accusation of the system of government that ruled in Poland between 2015 and 2023. And yes.
Go ahead. I wanted to ask you a question, though, there, because one of the things we're going to talk about in just a minute is court capture. Yeah. And you've described to me how under the Law and Justice Party, there was a degree to which the courts were captured by the party. And one of the things I want to do is talk about the role of courts as a kind of stopgap to authoritarian governments. Despite the court capture, they did not side with the government in your case, which I find absolutely fascinating.
And that's the second more structural lesson. That is, I realized that the pyramid, so to speak, of judicial honesty and integrity is such that the lower you go, at least in a country like Poland, in the judicial system, the more integrity, honesty, courage, independence judges display. The higher you go, they are much more obedient to the current rulers. And as a matter of institutional design, it suggested to me that it's really not such a great idea to have a highly centralized, concentrated system of constitutional review and to separate constitutional review from the regular judicial review as you have in the American system, followed in so many countries around the world, but almost all so-called transitional democracies have opted for a highly centralized system in which there is a single court, tribunal that has the monopoly on constitutional adjudication. There's the German system, French, Italian, and so on. Then South African, and basically all post-communist European courts. And the problem here is that there is a rational basis for such a design, for highly concentrated design. You can place really smart, courageous, intelligent scholars on this court, because usually these are courts, and you can do very fast overhaul. Well, that's not a great word these days, I think, with the judicial overhaul in Israel, but with the overhaul of the old legal system. But the cost is that if the authoritarians come to power, it's very easy for them to capture this court. You just capture a body consisting of 12 or 15 persons. It's much more difficult to capture 10,000 judges, and that's the number of regular judges in Poland. So if they were trained and empowered, constitutionally I claim they are empowered, but if they are empowered by certain practice, that they are all, a little bit like in Barbary v. Madison, in charge of constitutional adjudication, it would be much, much more difficult for the authoritarian rulers to capture them.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, that's a great place for us to start. So, Rogers, when we were corresponding about how we would kick this off, you suggested that I might ask you what you've been doing in retirement, and I know that's not golfing. So, or at least not too much golfing, right? So probably not golfing at all, but working on these very issues. So maybe you can tell us what you've been working on in relation to these topics.
Well, I've been working in part as a scholar of American constitutional and political development on the comparison of our current moment with periods of deep division in the past of our country. And while no divisions are as severe as those of the Civil War, there are distinctive features to this moment that relate all too much to the question of the survival of democracy. We have now an administration shaped by a political movement that has very different conception of who really counts as an American than those of their opponents. One thing I study is the history of citizenship, and we have some of the public intellectuals associated with the MAGA movement arguing that there are lots of people who are legally American citizens, but they're not really Americans because they don't have the right values, perspectives, in some cases, cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And so we have in power representatives of a political movement that regards the opposition as illegitimate, not the loyal opposition, not the disliked but still fellow citizen opposition, but as a corrupt enemy. That's combined with the fact that we also have an administration, many of whose leaders, like Stephen Miller and Russell Vogt, take the view that not only are the people in their opposition, many of them illegitimate, the institutions of the American state that have been built up since the progressive era include many institutions, the modern regulatory administrative state, that they regard as fundamentally unconstitutional and illegitimate. And taking the view that their opposition includes a lot of people that are not legitimate Americans, and that those people are championing and embedded in institutions that they regard as constitutionally illegitimate. They therefore feel entitled to take pretty drastic actions to restore the country to what they sincerely believe it should be.
Right, right. And so we're going to talk about that more when we talk about populism, which is, it sounds like this project builds very much on your past work on populism. And I want to ask you more about that as we get into the discussion more. So let me now ask Mitt, from the standpoint of someone who has studied Eastern Europe very deeply for many years, I imagine that your work has only grown more and more relevant to the current situation in the United States in many ways. And how do you see, in addition to the relevance of your work on the U.S. Landscape, of course, your work on Ukraine and on Russia has been at the forefront of everybody's mind in a lot of ways since the war broke out in 2022. So how has the study that you've done of Eastern Europe come to shed light on our current situation in the U.S.?
There we go. I wondered how you turn this thing on. Thanks for the question. I've definitely spent a lot of time looking at a lot of different countries in Central and Eastern Europe, not least Poland, but also Hungary, which are two of the countries that are most remarked on with regard to backsliding of democratization. But also a lot of others, and I have my own kind of general view about this situation, that when I look at European politics, a lot of Europeans, it has to be said, are rather despondent about the prospects for democracy. They're worried that the AfD, the sort of more extreme right party, will take power in Germany. They're worried that Marine Le Pen's party will take power in France. I see things slightly differently, honestly, and I see a lot of parallels also with the U.S. I think what we've seen over 20 years now, I mean, populism was a hot topic already quite a long time ago, and there have been populist governments that have been in power in Europe since at least 2005, 2007, so for 20 years now. And what I don't see is them sort of as a rising trend that's sort of taking power unilaterally. Like, it's not a unilateral upsurge. Obviously it was an upsurge, but I think the situation we have right now is more what I would characterize as a standoff. So almost every European election and almost every North American election is a standoff between the powers of more nationalism, essentially, who want to see a more nationalist economic agenda, who want to see a more nationalist cultural agenda, who want to see a more nationalist political agenda. And the forces of sort of so-called liberal democracy, who basically have a more procedural view, or a different procedural view, about how democracy should operate that is more normal in the sense that it's been the case in the West for quite a long time. I see both of those camps as having fundamental strengths and also fundamental flaws that they're not able to really get over, which accounts for why there's a standoff between them.
So, in effect, nationalism and populism may or may not go together.
I think that the term populism is much used and was much debated in political science. People in that debate broadly always raise questions, well, is populism the right term to be talking about this in? Because, of course, populism is a political strategy of appealing to kind of the people. We know that people on the left, people on the right all use populist kind of appeals at various times. So a lot of people, debated what's going on. In my view, I think that that increasingly, I feel that term is not really the most accurate one for depicting what's actually happening. So it is, I think that basically what I'm trying to argue is that, which I argue, by the way, in a chapter in the Handbook of Polish Politics recently out, that basically there's a fundamental cleavage now in our politics in the West in general between the forces of sort of old school liberal democracy and the forces of a more xenophobic nationalism. And if there were one issue really that divides everybody, although there are several, it's really about your perspective on neoliberal globalization, right? So basically, in the West for the last 40 years, we've adopted a more liberal approach, or some would say a neoliberal approach to economic policy that had some strengths and had some serious weaknesses. Its strengths were that growth was okay, it wasn't like horrible, but inequality was massively growing during this period of 40 years. And of course, also in Eastern Europe, when they began neoliberal policies after 1989, inequality grew massively. And what that's produced is a situation where essentially there's a lot of people who feel left out. Although the general level may be going up, many people feel left behind and therefore are more interested in change, and they're more interested in the change being put forward by the nationalist parties who are saying, enough of this internationalism, enough of this globalization, we want to serve our own interests.
So this is sort of a preview of everything we're going to talk about, in the sense we're going to go back into some of these topics. But Bill, as sort of our internationalist on the panel, if you think about international institutions and international law in particular, some of that is a counter trend to some of what we're talking about, some of the domestic trends. And then there's some trends maybe that cut the other way, where we see a breakdown in respect for international law and an undermining of international law. And so ultimately, and again, we're going to circle back around to this topic, but do you think that, do you see any hope in international law and international institutions to save us from some of the democratic backsliding?
So I have to say, first of all, thanks for having me, and Professor Swiderski, thanks for being with us. It's been a hard month or two to be an international lawyer. I've looked in the mirror several times and said, who am I and what do I actually do? Because it can seem, when you look at the world today, like law no longer really matters. And even when you look at the current conflict and what's being said in the press, there's not a lot of articles saying this is illegal under international law. And I think that's partly because we've sort of given up on international law. And I think back to 1989, when I, at the age of 12, moved to the Soviet Union and watched the wall collapse and Gorbachev fall and Yeltsin stand on a tank, and it felt like international law, the arc of democracy, were all moving in the right direction. And we say, what happened in the intervening 35 or 40 years? But I do think that is too pessimistic a way to look at things. If we expect that international law will always provide the right outcome that aligns with our moral intuition and that there will always be a remedy, okay, international law will be seen as a failure. But if we think instead about international law, at the very least, providing us with a language with which to contest what we see happening, whether it be in the Poland that went after you or here in the United States, I think it's a very powerful tool. Because it's no longer just that we say that's immoral or unjust. We can say it's illegal. And that, to me, is an incredibly powerful shift in rhetoric. And when I spend time working for Secretary Clinton at the State Department or in my advocacy role fighting for human rights clients around the world, the ability to walk into a room and tell another government what you are doing is illegal goes a really long way. I think it also reflects here at home as a powerful tool, one that I don't think we as an American populace use enough. But ultimately, international law still tells us that it is a violation of human rights to do what we see governments do, backsliding, capturing courts, stifling the freedom of speech or expression. And if you're in the right place in the world, you may still have a remedy from that. And part of our challenge is to figure out how we find those international remedies, how we build coalitions of countries to put pressure on governments that are violating these rights, how we use the tools of law, the tools of media that I know we're going to talk about later, and not be captured by the media, but let the rules of law capture the media, right? All of that is part of what we have to do to make international law still matter today.
So I love that, Bill, and I'd like to know which rooms you're walking into where it still matters, because I've got to say, if we look at the recent Venezuela memo, the one on the Maduro raid, it was sort of more on the depressing side of things.
I'm not saying it matters a lot in the United States.
Okay.
We can make it matter more.
Right.
Make it matter more in America. We have to care. We have to say these things matter, right? This is still a democracy, whether we like the current government or not. And if the people say no to violating international law, left, right, and center, I still believe America can course correct. But.
So let me just pick up there, and just for those who haven't read it, and it's still, a lot of it is still redacted. And I will say something funny happened with that memo, and then we'll go back to the domestic stuff, but since it segues right off your comment, I'll bump this part of our discussion up. So we filed Searle filed a FOIA request for that memo and for the boat strikes memo, and others had filed for it also. And we have no idea whether or not this was coincidence, but about 8 hours later, the memo was released. We thought, oh, wow. Because usually these FOIA requests, right, they usually take about 2 years. So, 8 hours later, there was the memo. So what does the memo say about international law? It says, well, it is, the legality of this under international law is not entirely clear. It's possible that it's a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, but on the other hand, it doesn't really matter because the president is not bound by international law. And I was so struck by that because that other administrations have thought that, but they rarely come right out and say it and just say, the president is not bound by international law. And so it sort of cut me to the quick that this administration was so willing to admit that. And I wonder if you have any reactions to that.
Well, the United States is bound by international law. The president is the chief executive of the United States. The president is bound by international law. If any student says otherwise on their final exam in my international law class, you're not getting a degree from Penn Law School. The question is more how we create consequences when countries or individuals violate international law. What Trump is really saying is, I do not believe there are any consequences to me of violating international law. Maybe he is right. But the next time Vladimir Putin decides that he wants to go traveling to London, he's going to find himself hauled before the International Criminal Court. That's not going to happen to Donald Trump, and Putin probably isn't going to end up there till there's a revolution in Russia. But Putin isn't traveling to London, right? That is a consequence of violating international law. And our job is to create consequences when someone says they're not bound by international law.
And this, by the way, posed a very interesting problem when France wanted to mediate the ICJ dispute with regard to Israel and South Africa, and wanted to host, therefore, the parties for a discussion about this. And Netanyahu could not travel there because France would have had the obligation to arrest Netanyahu as a member of the ICC under the Statute of Rome. And so basically France asked for an exemption and was not granted it. And therefore the peace talks, the talks about the ICJ case, or the hostages, and mediate the hostage dispute could not be held there. So, I mean, there can be consequences. All right, let's go back to domestic issues then, from international courts to domestic courts, and talk about democratic backsliding. So courts can play different sorts of roles in the face of democratic backsliding. And I'm very interested in the question, when a democracy is going in the direction of authoritarianism, what you find courts doing. And I was struck in preparing for today to think about two kinds of roles. One is courts as a sort of backstop to that backsliding, and especially I liked your description, Wojciech, with the lower down the food chain you go in courts. Interestingly and somewhat paradoxically, the more resistance you might find, the more willingness to sort of stand up for the rule of law. And we actually have seen that in our own district courts. We have seen district court judges more willing to push back on the administration than circuit court judges, and by and large, circuit court judges more than the Supreme Court. So it's an interesting phenomenon with regard to the pyramid of judges. But the other role is for courts to become capture of the authoritarian government. And the question is, what determines whether you're going in one direction or going in the other direction? So maybe, Wojciech, you want to start our discussion off on that?
Yeah, so I think that in principle there are, with all sorts of nuances and subtleties, there are two basic strategies that courts can adopt and do adopt when they are faced with the assault by the executive. One is to keep low, keep quiet, some sort of apathy, resist, also abstain from taking important decisions. There were all sorts of strategies like that taken by the Hungarian courts when they, for example, postponed taking important decisions, say about Central European University in Budapest, cause célèbre in Europe, where basically they waited with it, sort of postponed considering the case until the time it became immaterial. And in many countries which are ruled by populist authoritarians, this is the attitude that courts adopt, perhaps wisely. I don't know. That's from what my friends, constitutional scholars in India tell me. That's basically what the Indian Supreme Court does, but also other important courts in India, because they are used to that type of strategy, looking back into Indira Gandhi emergency. We have to survive. We have to keep our political capital for the future, for better days. But of course that may become almost suicidal, because it means that they are not doing what they basically should be doing, that is protecting citizens against the self-aggrandizing executive. And unfortunately that is, I think, the case in Hungary from everything I know about that country. And the opposite strategy for courts, which is much more risky, is a strategy of resistance that is trying to fight, to use all their legal resources that they have at their disposal to, for example, invalidate laws which are adopted by the government. Sometimes these strategies are short-term, as was the case of Constitutional Court in Poland, which fought for the entire year from the December 2015 to December 2016, until it was fully captured through all sorts of dirty tricks and devices of the government. So they can do it for 1 year in this case, or they can, as regular courts in Poland, they can resist in much more obvious ways, for example, going to the streets, and protesting against the plans of the government, as they did in Poland, as they did in Israel also. So there may be all sorts of resistance, open resistance by the courts. Some reach the payoff, other not. But the final point I want to say is that from the point of view of the government, of the sort of semi-authoritarian government, that we are not talking about extremely oppressive governments. We are not talking, I don't know, about North Korea. We are talking about about hybrid regimes, as in India, in Hungary, in the Philippines under Duterte, etc., where you have both this executive which tries to abolish all checks and balances, but at the same time respecting certain principles, for example, free and reasonable fair elections. Okay? So in such countries, for the government to fully capture courts is not a very smart strategy either, because they lose the possibility of so-called blame game. Courts are a great sort of institutional resource, and Tom Ginsburg wrote about it very nicely, that, you know, you keep an institution reasonably independent, and you can throw on it certain unpopular decisions, I don't know, about abortion or other morally important issues, which will be unpopular, but for some reasons you want someone to do it. For example, as in Poland, because you have powerful Catholic Church which demands that. And you say, well, you know, this is the court who has done it. But this blame game doesn't work if everyone knows that the court is fully captured. So
you distance yourself.
Exactly.
You distance yourself from the results, you tell the court to do it, and you're not responsible for it. That's very interesting. And Rogers, is there a difference? So if we look from the first Trump administration to the current Trump administration, you know, I think in the first Trump administration, I remember as we came up to this moment of Trump against Hawaii, early on in the administration, where I think it was the Ninth Circuit, or maybe it was the District Court, I can't remember, it's the Ninth Circuit, I think, said the immigration ruling, you know, the immigration executive order was unlawful. And then the question was, we all waited with bated breath to see whether or not the Trump administration was going to obey the court ruling. Because the question was, are they going to go completely off the rails and just say, well, we don't care, we're going to do what we want to do anyway, or were they going to basically follow the courts? And by and large, in the first Trump administration, they more or less followed the court rulings. In the second Trump administration, we see some fraying of that. And an opinion was recently came out of the Minnesota cases in which a judge attached an appendix with nearly 100 cases in which the administration had refused to follow court orders. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see with regard to administration and courts.
Yes, let me say something first about the structure of the pyramid in the American judicial system currently. President Trump appointed a lot of lower court judges in his first term, but President Biden appointed more lower federal court judges than Trump did. And it's also true that in his first term, the Trump administration lost before the Supreme Court more than almost any other recent presidential administration. Now, what has happened since is that we do find that the Trump appointees at the lower courts from the first term do tend to side with the Trump administration, particularly the younger ones who may be hoping for promotion over time.
Right.
But the Biden appointees and the appointees of previous Republican as well as Democratic presidents often vote against the Trump administration. But this has set up conflicts not only with the Trump administration, but with the Supreme Court in relation to the lower courts. With the Trump administration, they are simply ignoring a lot of these lower court orders to a much greater extent than we have seen before, and instead they are rushing issues to the Supreme Court on the emergency docket or so-called shadow docket. And while the current Supreme Court actually hasn't ruled that much on Trump 2 policies on the merits yet, its emergency decisions have greatly favored the Trump administration. It has allowed the administration to proceed until the issue can be argued on the merits, and that means it's overturned a lot of these lower court orders that were trying to get the Trump administration to cease doing things of questionable legality. Now, when the current Trump policies are debated on the merits, I think that they will win fair number with this current Supreme Court, because a majority of the Supreme Court shares the opposition to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the opposition to the modern administrative state that the Trump administration favors. However, as we saw with the tariffs decision, the court is willing to say no to the Trump administration when it thinks it goes too far. And I think that, if Trump, for example, tried to suspend midterm elections or something like that, there would be definite pushback from all the courts, including the Supreme Court. But on much of the Trump administration agenda, I don't think that we can expect the Supreme Court to be a major obstacle. And so I end up on the role of the courts in confronting democratic backsliding, basically where Bill was in regards to international law.
Yeah.
If we are going to preserve democracy and the rule of law in this country, it will be because people vote for officials that insist on it, not because the courts will save us.
Yeah, and indeed, if you look at the Supreme Court rulings, that perhaps, and we could debate what's the most, in a sense, damaging decision to the rule of law, but I would pick the immunity decision, which has, as another colleague once said, the immunity decision makes the Constitution unconstitutional because it really sort of cuts the heart out of accountability in a way that no previous decision has ever done, accountability for presidents. I'm actually, since we're on domestic topics, let me flip the order and ask Bill to talk about courts first. On the domestic front, Bill, and how you see the role of courts with regard to the rule of law, the Minnesota decisions, and do you see courts as an effective backstop to democratic backsliding in this country, or do you think there's too much backsliding within the court system for us to count on courts in that way?
I guess I would describe them as a necessary but insufficient and sometimes ineffective backstop, right? I'd much rather have the courts we have than the courts a lot of other countries have. Our courts are imperfect, but they are still courts, and we still have judges who are willing to say no to an executive that overreaches. We may not like all of the judges on those courts, and our government may not always follow the lower courts, and I think it's really problematic that lower courts are no longer able to issue essentially nationwide injunctions, which is what sends everything up to the Supreme Court before it's blocked. But when I look out at lots of countries in the world I've worked in, they would do anything to have our courts. But I think we have become complacent as an American polity that we'll have courts and that we're going to trust them to backstop for us when there's backsliding. In reality, we have to see them as a piece of a larger political and legal struggle to keep the rule of law intact. Courts will play their role, but we need a legislature that plays its role and that steps up and says, no, the Constitution vests us with certain authorities that the executive can't take. And we need a population that steps up and says, ultimately, it is we the people that need to rely on and use those court decisions. We the people that need to engage our legislatures to ensure that they too are doing this. And ultimately, we the people that need to elect a government that believes in and supports the rule of law. So courts are absolutely essential, but when we think they're going to do all the work for us, It's not going to happen.
Okay, well, you teed that up perfectly for Mitch because, does Russia still have courts? Does, in countries where courts are really captured by an authoritarian government, when you think about Eastern Europe, in those instances, is there still a functioning court system?
I guess I would take it a little more broadly, but I would say, look, when you're talking about Russia, one's talking about one of the most authoritarian dictatorial countries in the entire world, right? It's probably ranked more with like Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's like a amazingly good comparison for the U.S.,
Right.
I think what we are descending into, I guess you could say, is more of like a competitive authoritarian system, which is what Gavin Newsom, by the way, called this today. And that is more a system where you have an authoritarian leader who does face elections. Let me just focus on that for a second. I think the basic problem here is that we're losing elections. Liberals are losing elections, okay? Now, conservative, nationalist, populists, whatever you want to call them, also losing elections. I'd like to point out that we're sort of beating our chests about this here today, but actually one could alternatively celebrate potentially that Viktor Orban, who's been dictating policy in Hungary illegally, or actually quite legally, but he simply had so many votes when he came into power that he changed the constitution to make everything he did legal. And so he's constitutionally running
A little like the immunity decision, I should point out.
Running things like a dictatorship for
Right.
16 years, but guess what? As everybody would say, the institutions were so tilted, the laws were tilted, the electoral laws are tilted, he's losing this election, it appears. And not only losing it by a little bit, but he may lose it by a lot, in the sense that the new candidate who comes in may be able to himself change the Constitution because he'll have a constitutional supermajority. So the issue is that populists or nationalists are losing elections because people don't like their policies. And the real problem I think that we have more control over is the fact that liberals are losing elections too, right? So liberals are going head-to-head, procedural Democrats are going head-to-head with these people who a lot of people don't like. Like, look at Trump in the United States. His approval rating is not very high. It is not high. He's not like a super popular politician like Ronald Reagan was, right?
But he still won the 2024 election, and he won it fair and square.
I mean, maybe so, but
Right.
what I'm saying is that what's happening, we need to look, I think, a little bit introspectively and say, what the problem we're having is we're losing elections, and I can tell you why I think we're losing elections. We're losing elections because essentially people don't perceive procedural democracy in this country to be important. They don't. And the reason is because they've had a lot of democratic procedures and they've had a lot of elections over a very long period of time, and they don't feel that they're getting represented. People are shedding not only from, also from different political party affiliations. People don't trust the political parties. People, by the way, increasingly, Pew had an interesting poll out that showed people in America don't trust each other very much anymore either. So majorities of the population are now saying, would you trust other Americans to be like a good person most of the time? And majorities say no, they wouldn't, which is also a hallmark of sort of authoritarianism. The reason is, and I have to go back to this, is basically because Trump is picking up the non-college educated vote. He's picking up the working class, essentially. And I don't mind saying I'm a Democrat and I campaign for Democrats, okay? And when I do campaigning, that means I do door-to-door campaigning. I go knock on doors and talk to hundreds and hundreds of people. And, it's very clear in the last election that the people who were voting Democrat were basically like the faculty at Penn and then the staff at Penn. But like anybody who is like in a sort of working class position was voting Trump, essentially. And that's very different from the way things worked when I was a kid. I ran into one guy who was like the epitome of like the Catholic working class voter who was still voting Democrat. And I almost wanted to take a photo of him because he was like, a lost tribe or something. But like, the reality is that, that the liberal Democrats who are very hung up on procedure, which of course is very important, right? We all know that procedure is very important. But the reality is that if that procedure is not producing results for a very long period of time, people are going to get tired of it. And that's really what's happened, I think, is that a lot of the electorate, you have to make the economy work if you're going to win elections in a democracy for more than 50% of the population. And somehow we've ended up in an economic system which works really, really well for a third of the population. And so until one, you don't even necessarily need to fix that. How many people have heard of Trump accounts in this room? Just to raise
Trump
your hand.
accounts, yeah.
Trump accounts. Yeah, like maybe half the people have heard of this thing, right? How many people know anybody, does anybody know that it actually exists? Does anyone know anyone actually has a Trump account or got awarded? Probably not, but.
Can't have one till after July 4th of this year.
Okay, so I'll wait, I'll ask that question again after July 4th. The point is that
We'll have to reconvene over the summer.
You can promise to do things, like one of the reasons that one of the ways you can win people over is you don't even have to really do anything, as Trump has shown. You just have to seem like you're gonna do things, right? I don't know if anybody also heard, did anyone hear about like the tariff rebate checks people were supposed to do?
Right.
Everybody heard about that. Did those happen?
No.
Right, but at the same time, it's a signal, a very strong signal that you're going to be giving back something like to this population who seems quite, interested in that.
So I want to flip now to another topic, and I want to cover a few topics, and then I want to let the audience in for questions. So get ready with your questions. We're going to turn to you in about 10 minutes. So I want to talk about the media, okay, and independence of the media, because another typical hallmark of authoritarianism is we talk about democratic backsliding and democracies that sort of end up weakening and going towards authoritarianism is lack of independence of the media. And one of the things that we've been seeing in the United States these days is a sense that the media is less and less independent and concern about that. Now, to this criticism, it is often said, well, look, the BBC is run by the state, which is sort of true, sort of not. It's publicly run. We have media outlets like Al Jazeera, which are run by the state. And on certain topics, there is very little independence there. On other topics, there's more. And the question is, where are we located these days? We've seen a lot of change in media practices. We've seen the White House and the Pentagon and other government agencies very, very tightly controlling media access, drumming out media and refusing to talk to media that gives them unfavorable press. We've seen the president repeatedly attack media. Then we've seen arrest of journalists recently in the Minnesota situation. And we've also seen a lot of criticism of the current administration in the press. We've also seen changes in ownership, and we've seen dramatic changes in the practices of privately run media to avoid getting attacked by the administration, a little like the kinds of pressure that we've seen with law firms and even to some extent with universities. So the question that I want to ask is, through this kind of exerted pressure, what do we think is happening with the independence of the media? What kind of role does that play in democratic backsliding, and what comparisons do we make to some of the other democracies that have transitioned towards, democratic backsliding and loss of democracy? Wojciech?
Yeah, well, I just would like to say that probably the independence of media becomes less and less relevant because media become less relevant. And by that I mean legacy media. I mean, when you talk about BBC or Al Jazeera, etc., I realize that for many people in the generation of my son, and his friends, legacy media don't exist for them. They are extremely well versed in the information about the world, but through their bubbles in social media. They don't, we may get very upset about what's going on in, I don't know, CBS or NBC or on CNN, etc., and who's going to own it. But I'm afraid that it may be both generational and class issue. For many people, social media replace media in the sense of legacy media. And for social media, of course, the independence also poses itself as an important problem, but in quite a different way. That is that there is plenty of money to be made on monetization, or whatever is the word for, you getting money from, I don't know, YouTube, etc. And that becomes a matter of purely economic interests, which will control increasingly those social media.
Well, and that's part of the issue, right, which is that there is, even if there's not direct censorship, and sometimes there is direct censorship, but even when there's not direct censorship, there's self-censorship, right? And as you say, it may, the degree to which it's important is something you can question, but at least we know one thing, which is the administration thinks it's important. The administration cares about legacy media, right? Now, Rogers, sort of what is your view of the role of media over time with regard to democracy? Because this is not the first administration to attack media. Let's not forget that Obama was attacking media using, or threatening to attack media using the Espionage Act and threatening to prosecute media under that act. So this is, it's not as though everything was First Amendment all the way until we got to Trump.
Well, I want to agree with the concerns about some of the administration's current actions, but I want to agree even more with what Professor Swiderski just said about the nature of our media problem. At the end of World War II, John Kenneth Galbraith put forth a vision of American governance in which we could have a more powerful state, but it would be met by countervailing powers in the private sector. And meanwhile, the government would be a countervailing power against powerful private corporations. And part of that picture was media, but currently, we have a pattern of increasing oligopolies of the legacy media, and ironically, this means that they are proving not to be countervailing powers so much. The administration has found ways to bring pressure on them. So Jeff Bezos with the Washington Post, and now with CBS, we're seeing these media being more compliant with the administration rather than playing a countervailing role. Having said that, the reality is that most Americans, and not just young ones, are now getting their information through social media. And there, the problem isn't censorship. The problem actually is their choices, where they choose to listen to things that simply reinforce and often amplify their views, including their distrust of their fellow Americans. And this poses an unprecedented challenge in many ways. Our older doctrines of how we regulate the media constructively to promote free speech, but also a constructive contestation of ideas, those answers don't work in this new environment. And so it is a challenge for governance in the 21st century to try to find ways that the social media don't operate in some ways to give people what they want, but in ways that create a society that none of us wants.
Yeah, and in connection with that, and sort of, though either of you may want to talk about media, I also want to talk about the connected issue of privacy. Now, recently, we learned that from the hearing that Pam Bondi had before Congress, she had sort of opposition notes in talking about the Epstein matter. And where did those come from? Well, it turned out that members of Congress who had gone to inspect the Epstein files, their internet surfing had been clocked, basically, by the administration, and the administration had done quite a lot of research on them and had prepared notes to equip Pam Bondi so that she could push back at their questioning, and who knows what else they were doing with information. They were basically doing opposition research on members of Congress. Now, Mitch, we're used to Eastern Europe, and the example of East Germany comes to mind. And a famous movie that I remember with shock the year that we were living in Germany watching this movie, and to my horror, where sort of 50% of the population was informing on the other 50% of the population, and the way the Stasi worked and so on, where everybody nobody has any privacy, everybody is informing on everybody else. It's sort of the police state, trickle-down police state, and I wonder what the loss of privacy tells you about state control and how you think about the U.S. in relation to Eastern European governments.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, maybe more generally on, on media issues, there's been in Eastern Europe a concerted effort in places that have authoritarian leaders to sort of crack down on information flows, right? And to control them. And a lot of the methods that they have, engineered there are in fact being used in the U.S. I would say the primary one in Hungary was to basically buy up and in some cases shut down major news operations. Not only the state media that was referenced, but buy up all the private media. In some cases shut it down, or in other cases give it to a government-controlled foundation that then controlled advertising and basically controlled messaging in the private media. You see exactly that technique happening here in the U.S., where billionaires that are connected with Donald Trump are buying up all sorts of media operations, including recently CNN, prior to that CBS News, prior to that Twitter, right? Trying to basically effectively monopolize the media and social media space. And I think that's really worrying. I think in the U.S. it's going to be a little harder, but I think we're going to see a narrowing of the public-facing media. People in Hungary and probably in the U.S., I expect, will continue to be able to express their opinions, but only in sites that nobody watches. Increasingly, basically, opinion will be shoved to the sort of margins, where you could create your own website and say whatever you want on your own website, or sort of news websites or something like that, opposition news websites, but increasingly you're going to be crowded out of the major media. I think with regard to privacy, it strikes me that although this administration, I think, was like not, there's been a lot of concerns about whether we are going to be doing the same thing as China is doing, so we're looking at China and saying, oh, they have cameras everywhere, they're policing everywhere, they're supervising everywhere. It seems that increasingly the U.S. is just doing that also, surveilling everything. And it seems to me that to some extent people accept it. It's kind of the technology's there, somebody's going to do it. So recently, for instance, I went through a port of entry of the United States without my passport because it was a test. They were testing out a new mechanism whereby, you know.
Facial recognition.
Yeah, you just.
Yeah,
walk up to
entirely
the-
facial recognition.
You just walk up to the machine, it takes a photo, and it's like, okay, go. And it's like, what do I do with my passport? It's like, whatever. You know, don't worry.
Unbelievable. I mean, that is scary.
And my son commented to me, he's of the younger generation, he was like, isn't that exactly what we thought, you know, China was doing and we shouldn't do?
And China does have that technology
Yeah.
because when you walk into stores, there
We
is,
bought it. Maybe we bought it.
yeah,
Who knows? But-
conduct surveillance in every store. And Bill, your thoughts about this? And then I'm going to open it up to the audience.
Well, I'll be brief because I want to open it up. But, you know, in China, not only do you not scan your passport when you come into the country, but from there till the moment I'm sitting in my hotel room, I am being watched, and I get to my hotel room and it says, welcome, Mr. Berkwhite, and you don't ever have to check in, right? But here's the thing. To me, it's two pieces. I never used to worry about that because the capacity to process, the amount of data it would take to deal with all of that video was beyond the scope of governments. And unless they were already targeting you, you didn't have much to worry about. The problem in my mind is we now have the computing capabilities, the AI capabilities to sort and filter and use that data. Once you have that, you need a different set of protections in place because it used to be the sheer volume of data was our safety and protection. Today, we don't have any safety and protection because AI is munching that data and doing what it will do with it. So that, to me, heightens the need for protections that is exactly the point of vulnerability.
All right, why don't we get members of the audience in, and you have mics at your seats, so if you make sure to turn them on so we can hear you. And I should just also mention we are recording this, so just know that you are on a recording. We will be disseminating this.
We'll do something.
Right, exactly. Talk about loss of privacy. Just wanted to warn everybody. Please go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Sudersky and then a comment for Professor Orenstein. While I think we all would agree, Professor Sudersky, that we need more people like you, I can't help but wonder the cost to you financially, professionally, emotionally, and the cost, the time out of your life to be vindicated.
That's a great question.
Thank you very much. I stand by what I said, that I believe that I am a net beneficiary of what happened. Yes, I spent some money on it, but not an immense money. I also had some benefits of lawyers, attorneys working for me on a pro bono basis. For them it wasn't bad because these were relatively well publicized cases. We still had at that time, and we still have, really free press. So one half of the press and media were behind me. And so for them there was a clear reputational gain for their law firms, for them, for their names as a name recognition, etc., to do it for me for free. So money-wise, I spent some money, but not incredible amount. Emotional costs were minimal because they were easily outweighed by a sense of satisfaction that really, I can for once practice what I preach, and add that without immense risk. Okay, there was. I think although the offense of criminal defamation, if done by public media, which was my offense, can end you in jail for 2 years, but it was just unthinkable that they would, punish me, and if they sentence me for that I would go to jail. There was some slight risk that they would stop me at the border in Poland, saying that there is a risk that I would evade justice, but it never happened to me. That would be a practical problem for me. And in terms of time, actually, it was a great educational experience. So no, I really feel that it was for me an important, enlightening experience, and the costs were easily outweighed by the benefits.
It sort of goes under the heading of life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans.
And my comment for Professor Orenstein, thank you, Professor Sudersky. Not that I think individuals without the pro bono support of those law firms might not have been able to afford what you were able to. I agree wholeheartedly with Professor Ornstein about the appearance of giving something. I just happened to have looked into the Trump accounts this past weekend. I have a 1-year-old granddaughter. There's nothing that the Trump account gives you that we don't already have in a 529 plan much better. A $19,000 a year limit, tax-free accumulation, not tax-deferred, can be used for education immediately, whereas the Trump account, you got to wait till you're 59 and a half, and you're only allowed to put in $5,000 a year. The only thing that looks good is the $1,000 freebie.
All right, please, go ahead.
I thought this was a great conversation, really appreciate it. My question goes to a point which I think Professor Burke-White opened up about we the people and your discussion about media, and that is really the role of quasi-governmental or non-governmental institutions in defending democracy. And I'm thinking particularly about bar disciplinary boards and even we saw with the amicus brief of the Catholic bishops in the citizenship case. And I was wondering if you could discuss those roles in defending democracy.
So the roles of
Those quasi or non-governmental institutions.
non-governmental institutions, yeah. Who wants to take that? Rogers?
I'll just say I think that they're more vital than ever. And it is precisely because we have a lot of the population that is alienated from the leadership of both political parties for reasons that Mitch touched on, amongst others. Plus, as we've reviewed, we don't see the courts as sufficient to combat current dangers. And I would add that Congress is failing in its role, and that I think that the Trump administration is planning to govern essentially by executive orders from here on out as much as it can, and it will probably not get much resistance from the other branches of government. That leaves civil society. That leaves the American tradition of associations that Tocqueville praised that has, in the past, often been vehicles for civic renewal. Robert Putnam has a book on how we had decline in our institutions in the late 19th century and surge of civil society organizations in the progressive era did help renew democracy in important regards. They had limitations as well. And it is, I think, necessary now for a variety of kinds of NGOs to play a more vigorous role, but that means that citizens have to play a more vigorous role.
Well, one of the things that's very important in connection with your question, however, and that I debate a lot is, you know, do you want to bring lawsuits? Do these NGOs want to bring lawsuits if you're just going to be making bad precedent? And so the nationwide injunction case was a perfect example of that. So, you know, that was brought by our friends down at Georgetown who run a very parallel organization. And it was brought about something completely different. They didn't expect that to result in a ban on nationwide injunctions. Right. And so you have to be careful, very careful how you proceed these days, because, you know, you could suddenly end up making a piece of very bad law. The same thing happened with the immunity case, right? That was the byproduct of Jack Smith's prosecution of Donald Trump, a prosecution that couldn't proceed to fruition, obviously. But meanwhile, the gift that it gave us was the immunity case, right?
Claire, NGOs don't just bring lawsuits.
Of course not,
Whole
of course
variety
not.
of other actions that they can take and that we need to have them take.
Of course, of course. All right, we have some other hands up, please. Go ahead.
There's something hovering over this wonderful discussion, and that is there's law and there's the Constitution and there's governance, and then there's culture, and the culture of democracy and the culture of authoritarianism. This last discussion is illustrative of that, it seems to me. And among the many things that have made democracy so vulnerable is the rise of the internet and the social media age and people in their little, hot silos of conversation and so on and so forth. And I wonder if you just think of the internet and social media and how things have changed there and the impact on democracy. Is that true around the Western world and the Eastern European world as well? Or is this, I'm aware of how that plays out in America, and I'm also aware that America is the most individualistic society that's ever existed, perhaps. So it's easy for that to really become quite extreme. How is it doing in other parts of the Western and Eastern European world?
Can I address that?
Please,
really
go
quick?
ahead.
So I actually literally just yesterday had a young freshman Polish student in my office specifically talking about this kind of topic. So Poland is facing elections right now. It looks that the Liberal Party is like in the #1 spot, but maybe needs a coalition partner possibly to form a government. The #2 party is the sort of so-called populist party. And there's been a big run-up of much more extreme right parties that have in part dwelled a lot on social media. So what she says from the experience of somebody who's 18 is that essentially there's a lot of like hot rhetoric coming out, from Confederacja, for instance, or also this other party whose leader Gregory Brown is completely bonkers. And they're making quite a sensation. They get a lot of looks. They get a lot of, one thing, they underperformed in the last election. And I raised that with her. I was like, well, yeah, people are so super excited on social media, but these guys really got about half the vote that people expected them to get in the last election. So what's up with that? She's like, well, a lot of the people who may be liking this stuff aren't of voting age. They could be 16 or they could be 17, And even the ones who are 18 may not be like the most reliable get out the vote type of people, So I do think that there is that culture that has been picked up on more on the extremes in politics, both on the left and on the right, where it's again sort of crowding out sort of, a little bit the middle or sort of exciting. But, at the end of the day, I don't know if it matters that much in terms of the outcome of the election. The outcome of the election is still basically going to be either it's the liberal, kind of economic reform, pro-EU globalization party, or it's going to be the nationalist, not so into all those things party, right? That's going to win.
All right, I'd like to get some of the students in who are here from St. Joe's. I'm very glad to see you. Thanks for coming. So why don't we let their professor call on them?
Okay, well, go 1, 2, 3. How about if each of them will just say their question and then...
That would be great. Why don't we have all three of them?
Hello. Sorry. My question is, did the Trump administration break any international laws by capturing Maduro? If so, how did they get away with it?
Okay, and the next question, we'll take all three.
Hello, my question is, could you explain to me and my fellow high school classmates why the Trump administration chose to disobey international law by attacking Iran?
Okay, and the third question?
Hello. Do you think it could help democracy and bring more balance in politics if Democrats and Republicans alternated the presidency every 4 years? I think it could help. My question is, what do you think?
All right, well, we got two on international law, so Bill, maybe you should start with that.
Let me take those two. So Article 2.4 of the UN Charter says that it is illegal to invade other countries, and it's certainly illegal to show up there and capture their head of state and bring them home, and it's illegal to launch a war of aggression against them. So The answer to Venezuela
Doesn't literally say that, but
no, but that's that's the legal interpretation of Article 2.4 of the Charter. And so the answer to Venezuela and Iran is the same thing. Yes, it's illegal. But the deeper question you asked is, why did the Trump administration do it, and are there going to be any consequences? One of the benefits and also the downfalls of being the most powerful country in the world is that it's really hard for anybody else to hold us accountable the way we might, hold a government that, or a leader of a different country that launched such a war. But I do think there will be consequences. The hand of justice is not always fast, and sometimes it takes a long time. Vladimir Putin is the example I keep using. You might laugh if I say he'll end up in The Hague someday being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. But I'll tell you, there may come a moment where there's a revolution in Russia and the current regime needs to get rid of him. And guess where he can go? I met with a war criminal once in eastern Congo, a warlord who ran an army of child soldiers. And he kept telling me how he was never going to be prosecuted for it. You know where he was the next time I met him? In a jail cell in The Hague being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. And I do think there'll be consequences for the United States, too. I'm not sure our current president will suffer these consequences, but it's going to be a lot harder to get other countries to trust us and to work with us. And that's the cost of violating international law.
so maybe Rogers wants to answer the very interesting question of what if Democrats and Republicans were to alternate every 4 years?
Well, I very much understand the appeal of that, but if they were to alternate, there might be circumstances in which the incoming administration did not really represent the choice of the American people at that time, and so that wouldn't really be democratic. Plus, it would reinforce something that the two major parties have already created. They have set up a system of rules that privilege those two parties against third parties in this country. And we have a situation in which lots of Americans don't feel well represented by the two major parties. So rather than further entrenching their power, I think we should look for reforms to open up our system so that more people feel represented by a greater number of parties than we have now.
But it is worth pointing out that in the beginning of our republic, we had a system where the person who got the most votes would be president, and the person who got the second most votes would be vice president. And so if you're looking to, sort of split the baby, there would be ways to have less of a strictly sort of party system. In our system, if you're in the winning party, you somehow suddenly have such disproportionate power, unlike in a European parliamentary system where very often you have to put together a coalition with other parties. So it is worth thinking about shared governance, shared power, and maybe that was somewhat behind your question. We'll finish with this round of comments.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to one of the students' questions. So one other way, you gave an excellent response of why, but it occurred to me there's one other answer to this question that we all know about, but we haven't said specifically, which is that when you're talking about laws and institutions in general, there are formal laws and institutions, but then there's also informal norms, basically, that underpin those. And that's really what's happened in the United States, is that those informal law norms have kind of gone out the window along with public trust, so that people don't anymore feel bound by the Republican Party or the Democratic Party would have felt ashamed to do something like this in the past, and even though they did do it occasionally. But now that shame is gone, the norm is gone, the sort of feeling that you have to obey the law, right, is kind of gone. That's something I'm sure all of us agree on, but I just thought it would be helpful to say it explicitly.
And I want to just point out, because I think it's a really important thing that comes out of this question about alternation. And by the way, actually, in the modern era, it's been about 50% of the time Democrats and 50% Republicans, even if it isn't a strict alternation. But the point I wanted to make is the fact that if a party knew it was going to win the next time, it has a strong incentive to choose more extreme candidates. And this is actually what's happened in our redistricting, where districts have essentially become solid blue or solid red. What ends up happening is that moves toward extremes. And similarly, if you do that, you end up, with this bigger pendulum swing between elections. And when I think about what tends to work in a lot of other countries is systems that actually don't privilege extremity in political views, but systems that privilege convergence or centrism. And that happens a lot better in the kind of multi-party system. But if you started alternating, or if you get a world where everything redistricts and a seat is always red or always blue, that's when we get the kind of extreme governance that we see a lot of today.
So we are all professors up here, which means we could just keep talking and talking. But unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I really want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. Please join me. And thanks to all of you for coming out on this wet, soggy day. We really appreciate it. We'll have more Searle events, and I'm sure more law school events, and the video of tonight's discussion will eventually be up on the Searle website. Thanks again for joining us.